Does anyone remember this episode of the Chalked Cast?
The synergy is going to be unbelievable. I'm not getting no egos in my team.
Well, me and 3 other of my friends took it one step further. Ahead of the Birmingham Major, I sat down with Mythalieon, CaptainDolphin, and Belleair, and the 4 of us drafted ourselves a soccer team based on the players available at the Major. However, instead of just putting names and positions on the field, we decided to turn it into a fantasy sports game. I looked at the average stats from all of the 2024 lands and came up with a point system that evenly distributed the impact of goals per game, assists per game, and saves per game, then attributed different positions on the soccer pitch to different ratios of these stats. From there, I randomized the draft pick order, and Myth was on the clock. Each of us had a different approach to how we wanted to build our teams. Since I had done the legwork to set up the draft, I had a bit of a knowledge gap in seeing what strategies would work best due to previously balancing how the points worked. After a few rounds in the draft, it became clear that Myth was just drafting the best player available and figuring out his formation later. And I knew with Belleair's background knowledge of statistical trends in the esport, he'd be putting together a very solid team. But where I really got nervous is when Captain Dolphin wrote this as his justification for drafting Rawas with the 3rd overall pick. I had my stat sheet all in a row to figure out what my draft strategy was, but Dolphin made it very clear from the start he was not messing around either. Over the course of a few weeks, we finished out the draft process and assembled our teams. I had drafted my players around the formation that I wanted to play, so I quickly put together my 4-2-3-1 setup with confidence. Belleair threw together a solid 4-3-3, Myth put together a 4-4-2, and Dolphin came up with whatever this is. See, part of the exercise was to put together 11 players that at least resembled what an actual soccer formation was, but the parameters I had set ahead of time weren't really the most robust. While I was personally imagining something, well, at least symmetrical, Dolphin's lineup did still technically fit within the parameters I had listed at the beginning, and he was at least able to explain how the team would have functioned as an 11-player side. Once the lineups were all locked in, all we had to do was wait to see how they performed on the pitch. Before the Major, I decided I wanted to track all the stats as they progressed by round. I definitely expected things to even out as we progressed more through the tournament, especially seeing as round 1 went for me. See, despite my near immediate regret for drafting my defensive midfielder Yan 10th overall, Furious' first round matchup was against the healthy Chiefs, which allowed him to run up the score big time. Along with that, we had an absolute masterclass showing between Vitality and Twisted Minds, where Nalpo got a whopping 1.4 goals per game. Putting him as my striker, getting 3 times his goals per game in points, was paying dividends immediately. I took an early lead with 31.92 points, landing myself 8 points above the nearest competitor. For reference, I expected teams to land around the 22-point range, assuming each player would earn about 2 points if they were placed well on the field. There was no question that Yan's 6.93 fantasy points or Nalpo's 4.2 fantasy points would eventually drop, but I was off to a hot start. In the second round, Belleair inserted himself firmly into the conversation. After the first round, I figured my 31.92 points wouldn't be topped on a per-round score, but Belleair immediately proved me wrong and put up 33.27 points. This in large part was due to 2 of his midfielders putting up 5.33 points for the round. See, when it comes to goals, assists, and saves, assists are the least common to pop up on the score sheet. If you took the average goals per game, assists per game, and saves per game from the players of the 2024 World Championship, you'd see that there were about 3 times as many saves per game as there were goals per game, and about 4 times as many saves per game as there were assists per game. These are the multipliers that I used for the true strikers and true midfielders that would only earn points based on one statistic. It just so turned out that both Joyo and Reddles, Belleair's last 2 picks in the draft, mind you, both put up 4 assists in their 3-game series. These performances, alongside a great offensive series from Zen, gave Belleair great stats for round 2. Despite Nalpo's 2-goal-per-game series against the Chiefs, the underperformance by the rest of my team actually led Belleair to take the lead in the league. After day 1, Belleair had a 0.19 point lead over myself, with Captain Dolphin a bit further behind and Mythalieon having some catching up to do. The third round would be the last round of the tournament where all of the players participated, as not only would teams be securing their bid to the playoffs, we'd also be sending 2 teams home from the Major entirely. Where this would really show itself was on defense. One thing I noticed when drafting players is that more often than not, a lot of the players highest on the saves per game board were actually players from APAC or SSA. Given that these teams are normally getting outpaced, outshot, and outscored, it made sense that their stats on the defensive side would flourish. After finding this out, I made sure my backline consisted of both Sosa and Catalysm from Luminosity, as well as Torres from Foot Esports. I wanted Lioro, but Myth drafted him way earlier than I thought he would. Now, both Foot and Luminosity were already performing better than the average APAC and SSA teams on LAN, with both teams taking a game in round 1 and Foot actually taking wildcard to game 5. But the Taurus pick was actually really working out well for me. Foot would end up losing to Team Secret, and Taurus would lock in his tally of 2.43 saves per game. While hindsight makes me wish I had put him as a goalie, since I gave the goalie a 1.2 multiplier on saves per game, at this point I was glad to have one of the event's best defensive options on my backline. Meanwhile, VK Salem would lock himself in with 2 saves per game as one of Dolphin's center backs. Not the worst performance ever, but considering Dolphin had drafted VK Salem right before I drafted Torres, the benefit of hindsight was making that pick look devastating. That being said, VK was the least of Dolphin's worries at that point, as the rest of his team was having a devastating round. Rawas had no assists against Carmine Core, bringing his overall impact way down, and only Razebull put up more than 2 points for him in the round. This underperformance would drop Dolphin below Myth, who was steadily chugging along, hovering between 21 and 22 points. One player that I had my eye on during the draft that I didn't end up getting was Swift. I was personally expecting Secret's new star rookie to be a stellar choice as a defender, based on expecting Secret to have multiple series on the back foot and his online stats indicating he gets more saves per game than the rest of his team. Despite being rather high on my draft board, Myth drafted him a few picks earlier than I wanted him. To my surprise, Myth put him alongside Atau as striker, which despite my high expectations for both Team Secret and Swift, I was doubtful of his impact up top. After day 1, it looked like my doubts were substantial, with Swift only having 2 goals in 7 games. However, day 2 is when I was reminded of the most important thing when it comes to fantasy sports. Nothing ever follows the exact statistical trends that you expect. In round 3, Swift put up 1 goal per game in his performance against Food Esports, but his real upswing was in round 4 against Gen G. After putting up 7 goals in the 5-game series that would see Secret out of the tournament, Swift ended up with 14 goals in 17 games, giving himself a 2.47 final score. After starting day 2 in last place among all the players in the league, he'd lock in a final score that would land among the top 10 for all players, and proving that quite literally anything could happen. Another player who continued to prove that anything could happen was NA's new Captain America Reddles. A player who was labeled on Captain Dolphin's draft board as "Don't Draft Reddles." Both him and myself were shocked at all when Reddles got drafted. According to a lot of statistical trends, Reddles usually performed below average in all of the important statistics for the fantasy league, and when he did overperform, it was difficult to predict which stat he would be great at. Despite the risk, Belleair picked him up with his last pick and threw him into the center of the pitch. Reddles ended day 1 with a more than solid 3.43 score, but with stats being inflated by facing Luminosity, that score was definitely expected to go down. However, solid performances against Ultimates and Secret led Reddles to have 15 assists on the event, and despite the brutal 3-0 sweep by Twisted Minds to knock them out of the event, Reddles would lock in a score of 3.00 as Gen G exited the tournament. The 41st pick in the draft managed to be the 4th best performer in the league and would help Belleair remain in the conversation for the lead. As day 2 came to a close, a couple of important results within the major itself massively affected the performances of certain players. As I stated before, usually the APAC and SSA players are reliable for stacking up high saves per game, as they're usually on the back foot and get eliminated quickly. Well, unluckily for me, Luminosity decided to extend their tournament by taking down the Healthy Chiefs in round 3. While APAC beating OCE2 has happened before, the real shock was when Luminosity took down Wildcard and made round 5 of Swiss. While Catalysm was never really performing in the defensive role all LAN, because he was busy getting 1 goal per game apparently, I watched as my goalkeeper Sosa's defensive stock trended down as APAC's hopes for playoffs trended up. Luminosity would get eliminated in round 5, locking in statistical underperformances and saves per game for one of my center backs and my goalkeeper. To make matters worse, Luminosity's final series was against Falcons, and this Falcons squad was efficient at converting all of their chances. Not only did this lead to my defensemen not running up their stats, it resulted in Rawas and TRK running up their score for Captain Dolphin. The connection of Rawas getting a 4 times multiplier for assists as a true midfielder, and TRK getting a 2.4 times multiplier on goals as a winger struck multiple times in the series, severely increasing Dolphin's score. Despite being in last after round 3, Captain Dolphin finished day 2 with the lead with a score of 24.18. While I expected the scores to be relatively close throughout the tournament, I certainly didn't expect to end a day within 1/100th of a player, which is exactly what I did with my 24.17 score at the end of day 2. Belleair was still within half a point of us both, but Myth still had some catching up to do in the playoffs. The lower AFL saw the Falcons' stat padding continue for Captain Dolphin, and he'd take himself a massive lead over the field. By the end of the lower AFL, Rawas had 20 assists in his 22 games, giving himself 3.64 fantasy points. Despite my striker Naupo locking himself a 3.25 rating with his 26 goals in 24 games, my team was now an entire point behind Captain Dolphin. Along with that, despite Belleair's second to last pick in the draft Joyo locking himself at 2.96 points, his overall team fell a bit further and was an entire point behind myself. Myth, well, let's just say he was waiting for Carmichael to run up the score. The upper AFL undid a lot of the separation done by the one-sided lower AFL matches. Dolphins-Falcons duo might have torn it up against Geeke, but he also had Exotic and Monkey Moon from Vitality. Their domination through the Swiss had Monkey Moon at 2.18 and Exotic at 2.93, and for a moment, it looked like this was going to continue with Vitality's combined 6-0 scoreline over Ultimates in the first two games. However, once the tides in the series turned, the tides in the Fantasy League did too. Monkey Moon wouldn't drop too far, going from a 2.18 to a 2.06, but a 2.93 scoreline is not sustainable at all, and Exotic would drop to a 2.49. This would put Dolphin back within striking distance, but he would still have a comfortable lead at the end of day 3. Along with this, Belleair's first pick Zen would at least have better fantasy stats coming out of the Ultimate Series, which wasn't hard to do considering Vitality beat NRG earlier in the Swiss, with Zen somehow getting no goals or assists. At the end of day 3, Dolphin would have 25.15, I had 24.56, Belleair had 23.85, and Myth needed a miracle with only 21.53. Starting off Championship Sunday, we had two spectacular quarterfinal matches between NRG and Falcons, then Vitality against Furia. With a majority of players now eliminated from the major, it would come down to figuring out the final scores of the players on the top teams. At this point, both Myth and Dolphin had 5 players remaining. Belleair had 4 players, and I had 3. For the quarterfinals, all eyes were on the league leader Captain Dolphin, as he had 5 players participating in the round. Hoping to hold around a 0.6 lead, Dolphin was relying on Rawas to keep some semblance of his performance up. While Rawas capitalized in the scoring department, getting 7 goals in the 7-game series, he didn't do as well on the assists, only having 2. With Falcons losing the series, this would lock Rawas in with a 3.17. While this would end up being the third best stat line in the league, it was a 0.47 point drop from where he was before the series, setting Dolphin back massively. Things continued to go south for Dolphin, as not only was Rawas underperforming, the only player whose stock improved out of his 5 players in the quarterfinals was lost, and he was the only player Dolphin would have remaining for the rest of the tournament. After ending day 3 with a 25.15, Dolphin would fall to a 24.07 scoreline. This would put him behind myself, who saw both Clears and Yan improve their statistics in the quarterfinals. With Belleair and Myth's 2 players each holding steady for the quarters, I took the lead with a 24.75. The semifinals saw Captain Dolphin lock in his final score for the league, as his only remaining player lost would lose to Carmichael. Despite his 6 goals in the quarterfinals against Vitality, loss would be held to 1 goal against Carmichael. With one last unfortunate statistical underperformance, who doesn't underperform against K-Corp, Captain Dolphin would lock in a final score of 23.86. This would keep him in second place for the league, but he'd need a massive underperformance from my remaining players. That being said, he would start to get them, as Yan also underperformed against Carmichael, shocker, and locked himself in with a 3.19 final score. While I'll never complain about having a pick I regretted making himself the second best performer in the league, where things looked dicey for me was actually in LJ's performance. A 7-game series with only 8 goals by the Ultimates was the exact opposite of what I was looking for, as not only did LJ only put up 2 goals and 1 assist, he ensured he'd play at least 4 more games against Carmichael. At the end of the semifinals, I dropped down to 24.16. A 0.3 point gap was relatively comfortable, but it wouldn't lock me in for the win just yet. If the finals went to at least 6 games without LJ scoring or assisting, I'd be in trouble. If the series went to 7 games and LJ had no goals and only 1 assist, I'd also be in trouble. However, if LJ just put up 1 goal or even just 2 assists in the finals, I'd have secured a permanent lead over Captain Dolphin. Meanwhile, if there was ever a time for Mythalieon's team to perform, it was right now. With his draft strategy of pick the best player available, he still had 5 players alive when it came to the semifinals, the most out of all of us. However, as I mentioned earlier, the series between NRG and Ultimates was rather low scoring. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, as Beast Mode would secure 3 assists for NRG's 8 goals, but with such a low scoring series, you'd expect the defensive stats to flourish, and that was not the case for Atomic. While none of the NRG guys got insane saves per game stats, Atomics was the worst, netting himself only 1 save per game. This would lock both of Myth's NRG players with a below average performance, so it'd be up to the K-Corp guys to deliver. That being said, Carmine would win the next 8 games of Rocket League straight to take the major home, so it all depended on the players being in the right positions. Personally, for my methodology of looking at players, there were 2 main factors I took into account when it came to where they should play on the pitch: their performance in past LANs and their performance online with their current team lineup. While the online numbers would never correlate to what we'd see on LAN, especially with regions like OCE, APAC, or SSA, it did a solid job seeing how those 3 particular players meshed with each other. For Carmine Core, both Vatira and Drali looked best suited for striker, while Atao looked best suited for midfield. The LAN stats backed this up for Drali, so it seemed like striker was a sure choice for him. Atao and Vatira's stats looked swapped, however, as Atao seemed like a better suited striker on LAN, while Vatira seemed like a better suited midfielder. With this, it wasn't the most surprising thing to see Atao as striker, but the real shocks came with Myth putting Drali in the midfield and Vatira as the goalkeeper. By the end of the tournament, it would turn out that striker was Atao's best position, and Vatira did have a better defensive performance than both of his 2024 LANs, but having Drali in the midfield would end up costing Myth big time. Drali in the midfield would net Myth a respectable 2.31 points, but putting him up top as striker would have been a whole point increase, as the LAN's leading scorer would have gotten 3.36 points. Now, there's no doubt that Myth's 2 strikers were best suited to be strikers, but unfortunately not making way for one of the more clinical superstars up top would cost Myth a chance at winning the league. There wouldn't be as much movement in scores between the semifinals and finals, because after all, only 6 players play in the finals, so by the end of the Carmine Core vs. Furious series, the only question really left would be if LJ underperformed wildly. After the semifinals, I was at a 24.16, Dolphin at a 23.86, and locked in with his final score, Belleair with a 23.51, and Myth with a 21.46. Once LJ sunk his first goal in the finals, I had secured the Fantasy League win, and the final scores would be 24.07, 23.86, 23.42, and 21.66. So congratulations to myself for spending way too much time on this, and a huge thanks to Mythalieon, CaptainDolphin, and Belleair for participating in the project. This was honestly a ton of fun, and I hope to do it again for the Raleigh Major. With the inspiration for this project being the Chalkcast episode where they drafted their teams live, it'd be cool to have a similar live stream for the draft if I were to do it in the future. But unfortunately, the timing didn't line up well between the 4 of us for the Birmingham Major. Hopefully you all enjoyed watching me break down how the league went, and hopefully you learned something about the statistical trends of players so you can brag to your friends and impress them with your knowledge. If you'd be interested in following along for a potential Raleigh version of this, feel free to let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.